Hey, what's up, guys? Um, I wanted to do a little of a live, uh, quick video today because these very often, but when I do, I try to take opportunities to answer them. So, anyone who doesn't know much about Patreon, that is basically our platform that we use where folks can donate, and usually they're pretty minimal donations, like $1, $3, $5, and it goes towards the channel because it's not free to run. So it helps with running Corrales Radio and running God Bold Exotic. So if you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, you do get a few perks. One of them being what I'm doing today. You can ask questions, and I'll do either live videos and answer those questions the best I can, or I will also talk about them on a Corrales Radio episode. Since we did a Corrales Radio episode last night and I didn't see the question at the time, I'm going to do a live video and just talk on it for a few minutes. So, this question comes from Cole Wilburn. First of all, Cole, thank you for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. It definitely says a lot when you have folks that are willing to uh, go out of their way and actually become a part of something. So thank you for doing that. And Cole's question is, I'll go ahead and read you what he wrote, and I'll give you my thoughts. Um, Cole says, "Hey Jeff, I'm curious if you can touch on proper feeding for Amazons, being Amazon tree boas. I'm curious if there is a general massive prey per massive snake feeding ratio. I recently bought my first Amazon tree boa, and the seller told me that she has been eating 2 to 3 large mice every other week. So, we're going to be talking about feeding, obviously, and this can be applied to pretty much any species that I've ever worked with, not to mention um, any species that you work with, but specifically to Cole, I'm going to talk about Amazon tree boas. But this is pretty much my general ideas on feeding snakes. Obviously, for Varanus and geckos and lizards and turtles and tortoises, it's a little bit different. But for snakes, being non-colubrid snakes, so this is pythons and boas, this is the way I approach it. Um, First of all, know the species that you're working with. And I start with that because certain species have different metabolisms compared to others. So I keep two species of Corrales, Amazon tree boas and emerald tree boas. Anyone who's worked with both knows that they both have very, very different metabolisms, meaning you cannot feed one the same way or the same frequency the way you would feed the other because you're going to run into problems. So um, when Cole with the mass per prey versus mass per snake, my personal opinion is, and I don't have any scientific data to back this up, this is just my own thoughts. I think you're overcomplicating it. And take that with a grain of salt because I'm not trying to be offensive in any way. I'm just saying, I think that we as keepers get so enthusiastic and so into our animals that sometimes we overthink it. And I think that um, what works sometimes isn't proven by reading a document or some paper that's been written or a gram weight on a snake or anything like that. It's basically it's proven to work because your snake's healthy and your snake does what a snake is supposed to do. So read your animal and look at the animal. You can tell if the animal's becoming obese. If it's obese, it's going to have stretch marks in between the scales. The scales are going to be separated. You could even see rolls on the scales whenever they're coiled. There could obviously lack of movement and mobility. If the snake's always sedentary in the same spot and has no desire to roam around, you probably may want to space feeding out a little bit. On the contrary side of that, if your snake's always looking for food and it's always cruising and it's never, in a restful state, um, then maybe you want to bump your feeding up. If it's looking a little thin and you can see ribs, maybe you want to bump the feeding up. Obviously, if the snake regurgitates or has respiratory infections or some of those types of things, maybe there's a rectal prolapse, those things can also dictate the size of prey and the feeding frequency. If something's not right and you feel like you've kind of exhausted your efforts, I would obviously say take it to a vet that knows what they're doing, that's worked with reptiles and treated them, and knows what to do for snakes. But I don't think you really need to go off of a gram ratio. I think you're probably going to overthink it a little bit, and it may, in the long run, become more of a hassle than not. You know, the easier it is for us to keep these animals, the more enjoyment we get out of observing them. If we're always, working really hard to keep them healthy and stuff like that, then you don't want it to become a chore. I mean, it is a chore, but you don't want it to become a chore. So anyway, Cole, I think that you may just want to look at the snake first and foremost and understand the snake and the species you're working with. And Amazon tree boas are one of those species that you don't really run into a lot of obesity issues. They have a pretty fast metabolism. So my thoughts on feeding, and this is just how I approach it with my collection, is I do things very inconsistently. I don't want to keep my snakes on a set schedule because I feel like they get complacent. I want to see them cruising sometimes, and sometimes I want to see them basking. So, I could have fed my snakes the day before I went on vacation because we were in Mexico this last week, for instance, but I didn't. I fed them 3 or 4 days before then because I wanted them to get, a week and a half to 2 weeks in between meals. And then sometimes I'll go for a period where I'll feed them, every week. But I personally prefer smaller meals over larger meals. I don't feed my adult female Amazon tree boas anything larger than a small rat or a jumbo mouse. They're about the same size. Um, Jumbo mouse. I don't know what I said. But I don't think that you need to feed them 2 to 3. I think if you're going 2 weeks in between feedings every time you feed, that that to me might be a little bit of a stretch for the animal. I think you could probably feed them, every 7 to 8, maybe 9 days, and then sporadically let them go a couple weeks without food. I do that especially during cycling and during the winter time. I'll let them go a month without food. But if you're not in the breeding season, then I don't really see the point in letting them go 2 weeks without food every feeding. That's just me. I'm not saying that that's the wrong way to do it. I'm just saying that's how I do it. And I like smaller meals. So I would rather feed my animal a smaller meal and maybe feed them on a weekly to week and a half basis those smaller meals because they're easier to digest, than feed them 2 or 3 big meals at once and then let them go a couple weeks and they just sit and try and digest it. I don't think that's the best protocol for my snakes. And that's just the way I look at it. So I'm going to feed my animals a little bit closer together and then space some feedings out every now and again, but I'm going to feed them smaller meals. And what I've seen with my animals is they're going to be cruising around more, they're more active, their muscle tone, at least in my viewpoint, is a little bit, I like my snakes to be kind of lean. I don't like them to be fat. So I think if you're going to do this with your Amazon and you've got some questions, I would probably go to maybe a weekly to week and a half feeding regimen if it's a female, and I would not try to worry about the actual weight of the prey. I would just look at the animal. An adult Amazon's going to take an adult to a jumbo mouse or a small rat. But a yearling Amazon could take a rat pink, or it could take a mouse hopper. Those are things that you should kind of look at. I don't know how big the animal is that you purchased, but go by kind of like the girth of the snake and use that as when picking out the girth of the prey size. You want there to be a visible lump in the stomach of the animal once it feeds, but you don't want it to be so big and lethargic that I mean, you know, use some common sense is kind of the way I look at it. So hopefully I answered your question. If you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. But that's how I approach feeding. And I always thaw my animals out in water because I like the additional hydration they get from the water that's on the rodent whenever they eat it. But yeah, so that's kind of how I look at it. Let's see. Do you prefer to feed bigger mice or smaller rats? Example, hopper versus rat fuzzies. So that's kind of what I was saying. I'm always gonna, for Amazon tree boas, I'm always gonna go mice because I like the calcium that's in an adult mouse. You know, like let's look at like kind of what you just said. So you take a rat pink, which is probably the equivalent to butter, in you know snakes, versus a mouse hopper. Well, that mouse hopper has more bone development. It's farther along in its growth in its stages of life than that fuzzy is, or I'm sorry, that rat pink. So I'm probably going to go with the hopper. But do I think that there's anything wrong with feeding rat pinks and mouse hoppers? No, I don't. I feed my Amazons rats on occasion. I just make sure that they're smaller. And I said this a little bit earlier, so I'm always going to go with a smaller prey item versus a larger one because I'd rather feed my animals smaller prey items more frequently than larger prey items every 2 to 3 weeks and them just sit there for those 2 to 3 weeks to try to digest it. I just don't think that's super healthy. And I also, this is a good point I wanted to bring up, I also think that when I was talking about use common sense, think about it like people. Like, how do you feel after you just gorge yourself on a massive meal versus you eating a adequate sized portion, you know, and eating a couple smaller meals throughout the day versus one larger ones? For instance, one of my favorite places to eat is Firehouse Subs. I don't know, all you domestic people here in the US, you probably know where I'm talking about. They have the best subs. Well, when I eat there, I typically don't eat again the entire day, and I regret it because I always feel like just super bloated. But you know, if I'm eating a plate full of some fruit, some eggs, and I think you kind of get the point I'm trying to make. So that's the way I look at the snakes too, man. They're probably gonna feel a lot better with a smaller meal that's easier for their system to digest versus a larger meal. And that means you can feed them a little bit more frequently, and you're probably still gonna get a higher activity level out of them. That's my point. So I know I was kind of jumped around a few different places, Cole. Hopefully I answered your question. I appreciate your support on Patreon. I really appreciate you asking questions. If any of you other guys want to support our Patreon page, there's no limit to these questions. So if you guys want to cruise over and pledge, you can ask questions as much as you want, and you'll get videos or radio episodes that I designate a segment specifically to the question. And I'm by no means an expert, but I do have a considerable amount of experience, and so I try to answer the questions the best I can based off the experience I have. And I'm not in no way saying my way is the only way. I think there's a lot of different methods, and everybody's situation is a little bit different based off of where they live, what their resources are at their disposal. You get the drift, but this is just what I've seen and what I've done, and it works for me. So hopefully you guys have a good weekend. It's Friday. Woohoo! I've been back from Mexico a solid 2 days, and I'm already ready for the weekend. It's probably a red flag. I'm still in vacation mode. But you guys have a good weekend, and I appreciate the feedback that we get, be it questions or just comments on the YouTube channel. You guys take care, and we have a video coming out today, and then we've got another one coming out this next week. So support the channel, hit me up, If you have any questions, you can donate through godboldexotics@gmail.com via PayPal, one-time donation if you'd like, or you can cruise over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/Jeff Godbold. Take care, guys. How do I turn this off? Why is it not turning off? Oh.